I do recognize that this class is dealing with crisis counseling, and in that you will be dealing with loss, grief, and trauma. However, the likelihood that as a professional you will deal only ever with moment to moment crisis situations is highly unlikely. And so it would seem important that we discuss grieving and loss more in depth. I do want to note, though, that if you are working in a crisis counseling situation where trauma or loss has occurred, you will deal with, more often than not, what I might call a triage of services. You're dealing with the crisis or trauma at hand, stabilizing the client, and getting a team of people into place to ensure the client's stability and their safety. But outside of these crisis moments, should you have the privilege of seeing clients after the initial crisis or trauma, you'll be able to work with them through the grief and loss in a very unique way. But I think that it's also important to note that grieving a loss does not just occur in a traumatic or crisis situation. This process is actually very pertinent to many clients for many reasons. Think about, for instance, a client who has lost a significant amount of weight or is losing weight, or a client who potentially grew up in a legalistic or rigid background who is now coming to understand the concept of freedom and grace. How might the grieving process be helpful for clients like these? Well, if you were to look up the definition of denial on dictionary.com, which again is the first step to the grieving process, denial, you would notice that there's 8 different definitions. You would, of course, find the traditional definitions regarding maybe refusal to believe something or disbelief in the existence of something, or even the refusal or of recognizing or acknowledging something like Peter's denial of Christ. However, the definitions that I personally love and use most frequently in my practice are the final 2 definitions, which state denial is the sacrifice of one's own wants or needs, which is also sometimes referred to as self-denial, and then denial as an unconscious defense mechanism used to reduce anxiety by denying thoughts, feelings, or facts that are consciously intolerable. These 2 definitions give denial an entirely different meaning, I think. So, going back to the original question of how might grieving be important for clients who have not suffered traditional loss, let's use the example of somebody who's lost weight or is losing weight and flesh this out a little bit. So I might have mentioned this to a few of y'all before, that I am kind of a sucker for reality TV, and one of my favorite shows is The Biggest Loser. Throughout the course of the show, the contestants undergo incredible physical change, but they're also required to face head-on an emotional and mental battle that is oftentimes much more difficult than the physical battle. As contestants face the reality of the world that they have lived in, oftentimes they begin to recognize that their lives have been living in utter denial as they let go of themselves, they let go of their own wants and needs, and have not given into the reality that it really is as bad as they think. So as we look at how the grieving process might be beneficial for these clients, we see that their entire lives have been lived in denial. And while they're perhaps grieving the loss of the weight, they're also grieving the loss of the person that they're letting go of as they seek a new and healthy lifestyle. These folks grieve who they have been, the lifestyles that they have lived, the habits and the thought patterns that they've engaged in, and all that has gotten them to this point. If they did not get to this point emotionally and mentally, the physical reward would actually be only temporary. In Floyd's text, he makes an incredibly insightful statement. He says, ultimately, grief seems to have some relationship with a person's ability to form connections in life. We do not tend to grieve over lost items or persons who are not meaningful to us in some respect. When we form deep connections, a close relationship, for instance, the loss of that relationship is not easy to navigate. Feelings of grief and the grief process seems to be God's way of helping us adjust to losses, allowing ourselves to say goodbye and begin life anew without the object of our grief.